Picture it. You step out of a cramped elevator, the kind with a scissor gate and a nervous hum, and the doors don't just open. They slide back to reveal an entire skyline waiting for you, like it's been holding its breath. That's the moment. That's the whole fantasy. For most of the 1980s, luxury in Manhattan meant loud. It meant brass railings polished to a blinding shine, Carrara marble floors that echoed every footstep, gold-plated bathroom fixtures, and living rooms that looked like the lobby of an investment bank. Wall Street didn't just make money in the 80s. It decorated with it. Every surface screamed, "I can afford this," because subtlety wasn't really the point. Then the market crashed. The suits got quieter, and somewhere between the crash of '87 and the boom of the dot-com years, New York's idea of the good life changed completely. The 1990s Penthouse wasn't about broadcasting wealth to a room full of strangers. It was about coming home, closing 16 locks on a steel door, and disappearing into a sanctuary 40 floors above the noise. It was private. It was moody. It was, in its own strange way, cozy, even when it was the size of a basketball court. This was the decade that gave us the urban cocoon, floor-to-ceiling glass that turned the entire skyline into a piece of wall art, sunken living rooms you had to step down into, like you were entering a stage set for your own life, halogen lighting that glowed instead of glared, and city lights, millions of them, twinkling outside the window every single night, whether you were home to see them or not. This is the aesthetic that shaped a generation's fantasy of what making it in New York actually looked like. Before minimalism went all white and sterile, before every apartment on Earth started looking like the same Scandinavian showroom, there was a very specific, very confident decade of design: warm wood, black granite, glass block, and skyline views, and it deserves a proper look. So, welcome back to Yesterday Architecture. Today, we're taking the freight elevator up to the top floor. We're stepping inside the 1990s New York City penthouse. How it was built, how it was furnished, how Hollywood sold it to the rest of the world, and why, honestly, a lot of us miss it more than we'd like to admit. Let's get into it. If you want to understand a decade, don't look at its skyscrapers. Look at its kitchen cabinets. Walk into almost any high-end 1990s Manhattan apartment, and you'll find the same material vocabulary repeating itself. Penthouse after penthouse, like the whole city was working from one very stylish shared instruction manual. Start with the cabinetry. Cherry wood, rich, reddish-brown, and glossy enough to catch the halogen light, was everywhere. Kitchens, built-in bookshelves, entertainment units, even bathroom vanities. It was warm in a way the 80s cold marble never was, and it signaled something new. This was money that wanted to feel like a home, not a hotel lobby. Then there's the countertop that basically defined the decade. Black granite, polished to a mirror shine, speckled with flecks of gray and silver. It showed up on kitchen islands, on bathroom counters, even inlaid into coffee tables, paired with stainless steel appliances that were still, at the time, a genuine status symbol. Black granite gave 90s kitchens a sleek, almost futuristic edge that read as serious money without needing to shout about it. And then, the sofa. If cherry wood was the frame of the decade, the beige microfiber sectional was its soul. Enormous, plush, impossibly soft, usually facing a very large television we'll get to in a moment. This was furniture built for sinking into, not perching on. It was the physical opposite of the stiff formal seating of the previous decade. You weren't supposed to look elegant sitting on it. You were supposed to disappear into it with a glass of wine and the city lights behind you. Lighting deserves its own moment, because halogen track lighting genuinely reshaped how these spaces felt. Instead of one central chandelier dominating a room the way it might have in an older pre-war apartment, Halogen tracks let designers aim small, intense pools of light exactly where they wanted them. Onto a piece of art, a kitchen island, a reading nook. It created drama, it created shadow, and frankly, it made everything from the granite to the cherry wood look even richer than it already was. Now, let's talk texture, because the 90s penthouse loved a good contrast. Exposed brick, but painted crisp white, softened the industrial bones of older buildings without erasing their history entirely. And glass block. Oh, glass block was everywhere. As a shower enclosure, as a room divider, as an entire accent wall glowing softly from a light source behind it. It let light pass through while keeping a sense of privacy. And it had this frosted, almost architectural quality that felt cutting edge at the time. Today, it reads as pure, unmistakable 90s nostalgia. Let's not forget the smaller details either, because they mattered just as much as the showpieces. Walk-in closets got their own dedicated lighting and built-in cherry shelving, treated almost like a boutique. Powder rooms tucked off the entryway became a small design opportunity in themselves, often finished in a bold wallpaper or a slab of that same black granite, just to remind a guest, even before they reached the living room, exactly what kind of apartment they'd walked into. Now, let's step back and look at the bones of these apartments, because the layout tells its own story. The double-height loft became the ultimate flex of the decade, a soaring two-story living space with a mezzanine level tucked above it, usually connected by an industrial steel staircase with an open riser design. These staircases weren't hidden away. They were sculptural centerpieces, often painted black or left in raw brushed steel, curving or spiraling up toward a home office or a reading loft that looked directly down onto the party below, and then the windows. Floor-to-ceiling glass wasn't just a design choice. It was the entire point of buying a penthouse in the first place. Manhattan real estate has always sold a view as much as it sells square footage, and the 90s took that logic to its natural conclusion. Entire walls of uninterrupted glass, sometimes curving around a corner unit, turning the Empire State Building or the Chrysler Building's spire into a permanent, ever-changing piece of art that changed with every hour, every season, every storm rolling in over the Hudson. Flooring played its own quiet supporting role in all of this. Wide plank hardwood, often stained a deep espresso or honey tone, ran underfoot through most of these apartments, occasionally interrupted by a plush wall-to-wall carpet in the bedroom. Because, as sleek as these penthouses were, comfort was still non-negotiable. And in bathrooms, you'd frequently find a variation on the same theme as the kitchen. Black or forest green marble, sometimes paired with brass fixtures that had survived in a slightly more restrained form from the previous decade's obsession with shine. Even the color palette followed a strict, almost unspoken code. Deep jewel tones, burgundy, hunter green, navy, showed up in throw pillows and area rugs, set against all that neutral beige and warm wood. It was rich without tipping into gaudy, moody without going dark, and crucially, every single one of these choices was designed to be seen at night, under the glow of that halogen track lighting, with the city sparkling just beyond the glass. This wasn't daytime design. This was design built for evenings, for the hour when the sun went down and the apartment finally came alive. Put it all together, the cherry wood, the black granite, the glass block, the double-height ceiling, and the steel staircase, and you get a very specific feeling. Not cold, not sterile. Warm tech luxury is maybe the best way to describe it. Confident, a little dramatic, unmistakably New York. Now here's where things get genuinely fun, because nothing dates an apartment faster or more charmingly than its 1990s idea of cutting-edge technology. Let's start with the single most iconic status symbol of the decade, the wall-mounted CD jukebox. Forget streaming, forget even the early MP3 player. In a high-end 90s penthouse, your music lived in a sleek black tower that could hold anywhere from 50 to 400 compact discs, mechanically shuffling through your collection with a satisfying whir. It wasn't just storage, it was a display case. Your CD tower said something about you the way a bookshelf says something about a person today. Except, instead of your taste in literature, it broadcast your taste in Sade, Steely Dan, and whatever soundtrack was dominating the radio that year. Then there's the television. And television almost feels like the wrong word for these things. Projection TVs in the 90s weren't a screen you hung on a wall. They were furniture, massive wooden cabinets housing a cathode ray tube projection system, often taking up an entire corner of the great room, with a screen that could stretch beyond 50 inches diagonally. An almost unthinkable size at the time. They ran hot. They were heavy enough to need their own reinforced flooring. And they were, without question, the centerpiece of the entire living space. But the truly wealthy didn't just own a big television. They hid it. Enter the motorized art-revealing screen, one of the most delightfully theatrical inventions of the decade. A painting, or a mirror, or a wood panel would sit flush against the wall, and at the press of a remote, it would silently glide upward or slide sideways to reveal a hidden television behind it. It was equal parts spy movie gadget and magic trick, and it perfectly captured the era's obsession with technology that performed itself, that wanted you to notice just how impressive it was to hide something so impressive. Surround sound systems followed the same logic. Speaker cabinets, often built directly into custom media units, alongside the CD jukebox and a VCR, later a Laserdisc player for the true early adopters, created what magazines of the era loved to call home theater. It's a phrase we take for granted now, but in the mid-90s, having a genuine surround sound setup in your living room was the audio equivalent of owning a private screening room. And then, sitting right there on the glass coffee table in the middle of it all, the phone. Bulky, cordless, with a thick rubber antenna and a battery that lasted maybe 45 minutes. But it was cordless, and in a decade still largely tethered to the wall. That alone made it a genuine luxury item. Glass coffee tables themselves were practically mandatory in these rooms. Chrome-legged, minimal, and perfectly transparent, so as not to interrupt the sightline toward that enormous projection television, or, better yet, the skyline glowing beyond it. All of this, the jukebox, the hidden screen, the surround sound, the phone, fed into a bigger architectural shift, the rise of the great room. Instead of separate formal living and dining rooms the way pre-war apartments were laid out, 90s penthouses increasingly consolidated everything into one enormous open, multifunctional space. Cooking, entertaining, watching movies, listening to music. It all happened in one grand technology-saturated room, usually anchored by that sunken seating area we mentioned earlier, arranged not around a fireplace like the old model of hearth and home, but around the glowing screen. The television had officially replaced the fireplace as the emotional center of the American, and specifically, the New York, living room. It's easy to laugh at some of this now. A jukebox for CDs, a television the size of a small car. But at the time, this was the absolute frontier of home technology, and it was baked directly into the architecture of the room around it. These weren't add-ons. Media cabinets were custom-built. Wiring was planned into the walls. The great room wasn't just a trend. It was the physical manifestation of a culture that had, for the first time, decided that staying in could feel just as glamorous as going out. The kitchen, too, quietly transformed into a piece of that same entertainment ecosystem. Built-in refrigerators with paneled fronts, designed to blend seamlessly into the cherry cabinetry, became a genuine bragging point. among a certain class of buyer, alongside built-in wine coolers, and for the truly committed home entertainer, a small television or radio tucked under an upper cabinet, so nobody making a cocktail ever had to miss a second of the game. Home offices got the same high-tech treatment. A boxy beige desktop computer, a fax machine humming away in the corner, and increasingly, by the middle of the decade, a modem quietly dialing into something called the Internet. A technology nobody in that room could have fully predicted would eventually replace the CD jukebox, the projection television, and the landline phone all at once. And it's worth pausing on just how much status was wrapped up in these objects at the time. A visitor walking into a 90s great room wasn't just admiring the view. They were doing a quiet inventory: the size of the screen, the number of speakers, the thickness of that cordless phone's antenna, even the universal remote sitting on the coffee table, a single clunky device that promised to control the television, the stereo, and the lighting all at once, was its own small marvel of the era. In a decade before smartphones made nearly everyone's technology look identical, the gadgets scattered across a coffee table said almost as much about a person's success as the address on their mailbox. Now, let's leave the glossy Upper East Side towers behind for a moment, because some of the most influential penthouses of the decade weren't built as penthouses at all. They were built as factories. To understand the 90s downtown loft, you have to rewind about 100 years earlier. SoHo and Tribeca, an acronym, by the way, for Triangle Below Canal Street, were once the beating industrial heart of Manhattan. Their streets are still lined with astonishing 19th-century cast-iron buildings, constructed between roughly the 1850s and 1890s to house textile manufacturers, paper warehouses, and printing houses. Cast iron was the miracle material of its era, cheaper and faster to work with than carved stone, strong enough to support enormous open floor plates, and perfect for the tall factory windows that flooded these buildings with natural light, so workers could actually see what they were doing. By the mid-20th century, though, manufacturing had largely fled the city, and these buildings sat half-empty, vast, echoing, unwanted, which is exactly what made them so appealing to a very different crowd starting in the 1960s and 70s. Artists, painters, and sculptors, priced out of everywhere else, moved into these abandoned factory floors for the cheap rent and the ceiling heights, illegally living in spaces that were technically zoned for manufacturing. And that quiet artistic occupation is precisely what set the stage for the 1990s transformation. As SoHo and then Tribeca became genuinely fashionable, helped along by galleries, celebrities, and no small amount of media coverage, developers realized something. These raw, gritty, illegal artist lofts contained the exact bones that ultra-high-end buyers were suddenly desperate for: exposed brick, soaring ceilings, massive factory windows, a sense of authentic New York history that no new construction could ever fake. So the conversions began, and the 90s took the aesthetic to its logical, luxurious extreme. Original heavy timber ceiling beams, once purely structural, were sanded, stained, and left fully exposed as a design feature. Cast iron support columns stayed right where they were, painted or left raw, standing proudly in the middle of what was now a seven-figure living room. Pipes and ductwork that would once have been buried behind drywall were instead celebrated, left visible along the ceiling, sometimes even painted to match the space, turning pure industrial function into a design statement. And then there's the single most theatrical feature of the true Tribeca loft conversion: the freight elevator that opens directly into the apartment. No hallway, no shared corridor. The heavy steel doors slide open, and suddenly you're standing in someone's living room. It's a detail that sounds almost absurd today, but at the time, It was the ultimate symbol of privacy and scale, proof that your home used to be an entire factory floor, and now it's entirely extravagantly yours. Even the streets outside played their part in the fantasy. Cobblestone lanes, still surviving from the neighborhood's shipping and manufacturing days, gave the whole area a texture no uptown block could match. Stepping out of that freight elevator and onto a quiet, cobbled Tribeca street at night, with cast-iron facades rising on either side, felt like stepping into a completely different city, one with history built right into the pavement. Many of these conversions also came with something almost impossible to find elsewhere in Manhattan: private rooftop access. A factory built in 1890 wasn't designed with a shared amenity deck in mind, but a clever 90s renovation could carve out a private rooftop terrace for the penthouse unit, offering skyline views in every direction, uninterrupted by neighboring buildings that hadn't yet caught up to the downtown boom. What's genuinely fascinating about the SoHo and Tribeca loft is how it represents a completely different luxury philosophy than the uptown high-rise penthouse we covered earlier. Uptown luxury meant polish, new construction, custom cabinetry, halogen lighting engineered to flatter every black granite surface. Downtown luxury meant history, raw brick, worn timber, cast iron with a century of stories baked into the patina. Both were unmistakably 90s. Both were unmistakably expensive. But they told two very different stories about what New York wealth wanted to say about itself. It's also worth noting who exactly was buying into this downtown fantasy, because it says a lot about how the culture around wealth was shifting. These weren't the finance titans who dominated the uptown high-rises a decade earlier, or at least, not exclusively. The Tribeca and SoHo loft attracted a newer kind of buyer: film directors, fashion designers, musicians, and a rising class of tech-adjacent entrepreneurs who wanted their homes to signal creativity and edge rather than old money polish. A wave of galleries and film industry institutions helped anchor the neighborhood's reputation as a magnet for exactly this crowd. And by the mid-90s, owning a converted loft below Canal Street had become its own particular kind of status symbol, one that said you valued authenticity and history just as much as square footage. By the end of the decade, this factory-to-penthouse pipeline had permanently reshaped how the entire world thought about loft living, a legacy that, frankly, still shapes real estate listings and mood boards to this very day. Of course, none of this stayed confined to Manhattan real estate listings. Hollywood grabbed hold of the 90s penthouse fantasy and beamed it into living rooms across the entire world. Think about the villain's lair in a superhero blockbuster like Batman Forever: all soaring stone, dramatic shadow, and technology hidden behind moving architecture. A heightened theatrical cousin of that same motorized screen showmanship we talked about earlier, just turned up to a cinematic extreme. Power, in 90s film language, was expressed through exactly the kind of double-height space and dramatic lighting real penthouses were chasing in real life. Then there's the devil's advocate, where a luxurious high-floor Manhattan apartment becomes a genuine supporting character. All dark wood, dramatic city views through enormous glass, and interiors so moody and rich, they practically become a warning sign about the seductive dangers of that very lifestyle. The message was almost too on the nose. This much luxury, this much glass and shadow and skyline, comes with a price. On a much gentler note, You've Got Mail gave us a completely different vision. A cozy, book-lined Upper West Side apartment that leaned into warmth over drama, proving that the 90s New York aesthetic wasn't only about glass towers and sunken living rooms. It could also mean soft lamplight, worn furniture, and rooms that felt like they'd been lived in for years. And then, of course, there's Sex and the City, which, by the very end of the decade and into the early 2000s, cemented the idea of the fabulous, design-forward New York apartment as aspirational shorthand for an entire generation. Whether characters were sipping cosmopolitans in a chic apartment or admiring someone else's impossibly stylish loft, the show reinforced something the real estate market already knew. In New York, your apartment wasn't just where you slept. It was a statement about exactly who you'd become. But here's where the story gets genuinely interesting. Because right as the decade was winding down, something started to shift. The maximalist, technology-saturated black granite and cherry wood aesthetic began quietly giving way to something calmer. Call it the late 90s Zen turn. Influenced by a growing Western fascination with Japanese design principles, minimalism, natural materials, deliberate empty space, high-end interiors slowly started incorporating shoji screens, those translucent paper and wood room dividers that filtered light instead of blocking it entirely. Platform beds, low to the ground and stripped of ornate headboards, replaced the heavier, more traditional bedroom furniture of earlier in the decade. And indoor bamboo, potted tall, architectural, started appearing in corners of living rooms that, just a few years earlier, might have held a wall-mounted CD jukebox instead. Part of this shift also had a very practical driver: the rise of a new kind of lifestyle catalog and home store, selling an easy, curated version of calm to a much wider audience than the one shopping for cherry wood cabinetry. Suddenly, natural fiber rugs, river stones in a glass bowl, and a single orchid on a low table were everywhere. Not just in penthouses, but in ordinary apartments trying to borrow a little of that same serenity. This wasn't a total rejection of everything we've covered so far. The black granite stuck around, the glass walls stuck around, even the sunken living room concept survived. But the mood shifted. Less "look how much technology I can hide behind this painting," and more "look how calm and considered this space feels." It was, in hindsight, the first quiet signal of the all-white minimalism that would eventually dominate the 2000s and 2010s. But in the late 90s, it still had warmth to it. Wood, texture, a softness that later decades would eventually strip away entirely. So, by the time the millennium turned over, the 90s penthouse had actually lived through two distinct chapters within itself: the confident, tech-forward, materially rich first half, and the calmer, Zen-influenced second half. Hollywood captured both, and both, in their own way, shaped exactly how the rest of the world pictured what it meant to have truly made it in New York City. So here we are, decades later, and it's worth asking, why does all of this feel so warm to look back on? Because compare it for a second to what luxury tends to mean today. Walk into most brand new high-end developments now, and you'll likely find a very different formula. White oak floors, all-white kitchens, matte black fixtures, walls left almost entirely bare, and a kind of curated emptiness that photographs beautifully but rarely feels like it was made for actual living. It's polished, it's undeniably elegant, but it can also feel a little cold, a little interchangeable, like you could be standing in a luxury tower in Manhattan, Miami, or Dubai, and genuinely not be able to tell the difference. The 90s penthouse, for all its very specific dated quirks, the bulky projection television, the CD jukebox nobody uses anymore, the motorized screen hiding a technology that feels almost quaint today, had personality. It had texture. Cherry wood has grain and warmth that a flat white surface simply can't replicate. Black granite has depth and movement in a way that plain quartz never quite manages. Even the imperfections, the slightly too shiny lacquer, the chunky remote controls, the CRT screens that needed 30 seconds to warm up, feel human in a way that today's frictionless, seamless, endlessly optimized luxury doesn't always manage to be. There's also something to be said for how lived-in these spaces feel in retrospect. A 90s great room, with its enormous sofa built for sinking into, and its media cabinet stuffed with CDs and VHS tapes, was clearly a space where actual life happened, where you'd fall asleep watching a movie, where friends would gather around that hidden screen the first time you revealed it to them, genuinely impressed. Today's minimalist luxury often photographs like nobody's allowed to actually touch anything. And maybe that's really the heart of it. These apartments weren't designed to be admired from a careful distance. They were designed to be used, to have a drink spilled on that microfiber sofa, to have a stack of CDs slightly out of order in the jukebox, to have fingerprints on the black granite from a late-night snack. That imperfection, that evidence of an actual life being lived inside these walls, is exactly what today's staged catalog-perfect interiors so often seem to be missing. Maybe that's the real reason this decade's design has aged into such a specific, powerful kind of nostalgia. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't restrained. It was a little loud, a little maximalist, occasionally downright kitschy. But it was warm. It was confident, and it captured a very particular moment when New York believed, completely, that the future was going to be glamorous, and that you'd be watching it unfold from behind floor-to-ceiling glass, 40 stories above the street, with the whole skyline glowing just for you. That's the 1990s New York City penthouse. Not just an apartment, a mood, a movie set, a promise about exactly who you might become if you made it here. If you enjoyed this trip back to the top floor, make sure to subscribe to Yesterday Architecture for more deep dives into the design decades that shaped how we live. And let us know down in the comments which era you want us to unpack next. Was it the marble and brass excess of the 1980s? Or should we head even further back? Either way, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.